welcome to a new segment of Expert Insights hosted by the IPS. We are privileged to welcome Dr. Sanjeev Gupta, Deputy Director at the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department. Welcome, Dr. Gupta.
Thank you for inviting me.
We'll first discuss things, particularly developing countries like Sri Lanka facing rapid urbanization and in terms of fiscal stabilization as well. How do developing countries like Sri Lanka balance these priorities out in terms of growth as well as making sure that there's some sort of sustainable finance and fiscal stability?
You know, this is a challenge which virtually all countries are facing. They all want to grow rapidly. There are rising infrastructure needs, and the resource base hasn't grown as much. So these are the choices that countries are facing, and they will have to find the right mix in terms of making efforts to mobilize more revenues, which in case of Sri Lanka is an important issue, ensuring that the existing resources are used very efficiently, because we sometimes forget that there are a lot of improvements in the existing systems that can generate savings for new investments. And instead of looking all the time for new resources, we should also look around and see what are we doing with our existing allocations, whether there's scope for raising some savings from there and using it for more high priority areas. And so I would say that when it comes to the choices between infrastructure and other forms of spending, these are really things which countries have to decide on their own, depending on their social preferences. Of course, infrastructure is crucial, so is the provision of social services. So one cannot go into the extreme case where we just provide one service at the expense of something else. So we have to maintain a proper balance and ensure that there is good use of public resources.
You mentioned making savings from within. What sort of specific savings would you kind of foresee?
Okay, I can give you a couple of examples. One thing we find that countries are spending a lot of money on public investment, which they have to spend, but there are certain kinds of things they do. They don't do good project selection. They don't appraise the things very well. The implementation is not done in the best possible way. So one could examine each of those steps, and in doing so one will be able to achieve some kind of savings that could be used for newer programs.
At the same time, one of the big issues that curtails this sort of reform process is political backlash that comes from within the country. What sort of steps can the government take to kind of balance the political backlash while also engaging with the reforms, particularly during election cycles? Reform processes go out of the window, more or less.
I mean, you are absolutely right. We just did a book early this year. The title of the book was Fiscal Politics. And one of the things that we studied there was the impact of elections on different decision-making processes. What happens to taxes? What happens to spending plans? What happens to composition of spending in the year of elections? And yes, elections do have an impact. We found that wages, public sector wages, tend to rise during elections. This is especially in emerging markets. So the only way we can deal with these kind of pressures, which are bound to rise in a democratic setup, is that you set up some kind of a rules which prevent governments from taking advantage of electoral situation. For example, in countries where they have strong fiscal rules, which don't allow this kind of thing to happen, then you find lesser incidents of wages increasing during the election. So one can set up institutional frameworks that are strong enough to withstand the pressure of elections.
Right. I mean, so it also depends on how strong those institutions are.
That's correct.
Because,
Absolutely.
I mean, Sri Lanka, for example, passed the Fiscal Management Act
I know.
back in 2003, but
Yeah, they jettisoned it in 2004.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, coming back to Sri Lanka, and more particularly on Sri Lanka, since you're from the Fiscal Affairs Department, what are some of the 3 priority areas you would say that are important for Sri Lanka in terms of its fiscal stabilization?
I think the topmost area in which we are working with Sri Lanka on is strengthening the revenue base. The revenue to GDP ratio in Sri Lanka is relatively low compared to its competitors, and we believe there is potential to raise more. And we are heavily engaged with the authorities in trying to not only design the systems but also put into place the administrative framework which is modern and would allow Sri Lanka to reap more benefits from this side. So first is the clearly the revenue side that has to be strengthened. Then I will go back to the quality of spending. The reason why I say that is there's no point in collecting more revenues if you just waste that money. So we need to assess the quality of spending all the time to make sure the resources are not wasted. And then the other thing is to put in place good institutions which can withstand the pressures of time.
And do you feel that Sri Lanka is on the right path in terms of addressing these 3 priority areas?
I believe so. I think when I look at the numbers that were presented yesterday and the discussions that I've had with the former finance minister, it seems that things are on the right track.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Gupta.
Thank you
very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.